This is a really nice large group, one of my largest and by far the most far-reaching around the world. So thank you all for tuning in. What you're going to hear tonight is basically 2 chapters of my latest book, Long Island and the Sea. If you're interested in the book, you can get it at your libraries, unless you're in Australia or Wales maybe, but it's also available on Amazon and other websites and every bookstore on Long Island. And if you like what you hear at the end of the evening, if you email me at billbleyer@gmail.com, we can arrange to get you a signed and personally inscribed copy. Also, if you email me at billbleyer@gmail, I have a mailing list for the 7 lectures that I do. So if you want to hear other ones, you can find out from that email list. Also, everything I do is posted on my personal Facebook page and on the Long Island History Facebook page. All right, so let's get started. So when people think about pirates and where they operate, they're thinking of the pirates in the Caribbean with Johnny Depp. Maybe they're thinking of Kevin Kline on Broadway. But there were actually lots of pirates operating in the colonial days around Long Island. And the reason for that is pretty simple. If you look at the map, you have 1,100 miles of coastline, lots of deserted coves and beaches and small rivers. And all of this is very close to New York City, which is a major population center. So if you're trying to either smuggle something illegal into New York or smuggle something legal, but without paying the taxes and tariffs on it, how could it be better than landing somewhere in Long Island and then bringing it ashore into New York City? So this comes in handy through the colonial period, through the Revolution, and then later back during Prohibition. So a lot of the smuggling is going into New York City. Also, a lot of it's just going across the Sound to Connecticut. Again, trying to avoid red tape or taxes. So there's a couple of famous pirates we're going to talk about. One is very famous, and that's Captain William Kidd. And being that a lot of you are from East Hampton, you probably are familiar with Captain Kidd somewhat and the fact and his connection to Gardiners Island, but we'll give you the full story. So Kidd is a native of Scotland. He goes to sea as a young man on a merchant vessel that's traveling between New York and London. So he knows these local waters very well, and if he needs to hide something or sneak something ashore, he knows exactly where to go. In 1695, he goes to London to get a commission as a privateer. And a privateer, if you haven't heard of the term, is basically a government licensed pirate who's authorized to capture vessels from enemy countries. So in the case of England in the colonial period, that means French and Spanish ships. He not only gets his commission as a privateer, he meets the Earl of Bellomont, who's a member of Parliament and a very prominent English politician who likes Kidd, and to the point where he becomes his business partner. Later, he becomes the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and then the governor of New York. And in those roles, he creates some problems for his business partner down the road. So with his privateer license, Kidd outfits a vessel named the Adventure Galley and sails for the Indian Ocean. In May of 1698, the vessel reaches Madagascar, where 90 of the 150 crewmen desert the ship, leaving Kidd on his own with a skeleton crew and a ship that's sort of deteriorating to the point of getting ready to sink. So Kidd needs a new vessel, and he seizes a Moorish trading vessel named the Quetta Merchant, and he sails it to the West Indies. There's some question about whether the Quetta Merchant is actually an enemy vessel. The owners protest, and the British government decides it wasn't a fair prize and declares that Kidd has become a pirate, which is the beginning of his downfall. Meanwhile, Bellomont has moved on to be governor of Massachusetts, and he declares war on pirates, particularly his former business partner. He writes in May of 1699 that the inhabitants of Long Island were, quote, a lawless and desperate people, and he says they protect the pirates who are, quote, settled among them, and he needs tax collectors for Long Island, and he says the people are so in league with the pirates that he can't find anybody honest enough to do the job on Long Island. So he has to send people in from out of the area to collect taxes. He said many of them have been pirates themselves. So Kidd eventually finds out that he's now been declared a pirate. So he transfers his treasure to a sloop named the St. Anthony and sails for New England. He wants to go see Bellamont and clear his name. He brings documents that claim that he took from the ships that he thinks will prove that they were legitimate targets. But he's also wary of what might happen when he shows up in Boston to see Bellamont. So he does two things. He stops in Oyster Bay and hires a local lawyer named James Emmett and commissions him to go to Boston and meet with the Earl of Belmont to try to make the argument that he's not a pirate. To sweeten the deal, he sends some jewels along for the governor's wife. He's also leery of sailing to Boston with all his treasure in case things go haywire. So this is the story you probably know if you live out in East Hampton. He sails to Gardiners Island, and this is a famous Wyeth illustration of him burying the treasure a half mile in from the western shore of Gardiners Island. And when he lands, he tracks down Jonathan Gardiner, the gardener who's the head of the island, and makes a deal to bury the treasure. I'm not sure if Gardiner felt safe to say no, but to sweeten the deal, Kidd gives Gardiner a large swatch of silk fabric. And if you're lucky enough to ever get to Gardiners Island, which I was for Newsday, when you go into the manor house, there is a piece of that fabric framed on the wall, which is kind of cool to see. So after they bury the treasure, Kidd marks the spot with a cairn, which is a triangular pile of rocks. Later, the Gardiner family marks the spot with this marble monument marker, which is still out there. So having done whatever precautions he thinks he can make, he sails to Boston and meets with the governor, and Bellamont immediately has him arrested as a pirate. He then sends an emissary out to Gardiners Island to collect the treasure, and comes back with Gardiner gives a deposition and says that Kidd convinced him to, quote, take 3 Negroes, comma, 2 boys and a girl ashore to keep till he, the said Kidd, should call for them. And then Gardiner says that besides the silk cloth, Kidd has given him 4 pieces of Arabian gold, a chest and box of gold, a bundle of quilts, and 4 bales of goods. Gardiner also said that 2 of the Captain Kidd's crew gave him 2 bags of silver weighing 30 pounds, a small bundle of gold dust of about a pound weight, a sash, and a pair of worsted stockings. So all this is recovered and turned over to the colonial authorities in Boston. So Bellamont has Kidd shipped off to London in chains for trial. When he gets there, he is tried, and there's 2 trials. The first one is not for piracy, it's for murder, because Kidd, in dealing with his mutinous crew, ends up killing one of the crewmen named William Moore, and 2 of the deserters who left him, who abandoned Kidd, somehow end up there testifying, so he's convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. If that's not bad enough, he's also then tried for piracy, convicted on that charge, and sentenced to hang a second time. So they take Kidd to the gallows. The first time they try to hang him, the rope breaks. In some cultures, that's considered a sign that he should be freed, but England is not one of those cultures. So they drag him back up the steps to the scaffold, put a new rope around his neck, and the second time it holds, and he dies. They then take his body and hang it on this gibbet over by the shore of the Thames as an example to other people that might be tempted to go into piracy, and they leave his body there literally till it rots away to nothing. So that's the end of Captain Kidd. The same day in the same place that Kidd is hanged, the British hang another pirate named Joseph Radish. There's no paintings of him other than this one, which was actually done as a cigarette advertising. And he's kind of an unpleasant looking gentleman, which reflects the descriptions of him. Radish also has a strong connection to you folks out in East Hampton. but he's described by his contemporaries as fierce-looking, with a pockmarked face and squint-eyed. So the depiction on the painting is not bad. He's not as famous as Kidd, but he's got a good East End story. He goes to the gallows and dies alongside Captain Kidd. He almost takes one of the most prominent Southampton officials named Colonel Henry Pearson, a member of the Colonial Assembly, to the gallows with him for harboring him. So Radish is born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1672. And in 1695, when he's 25, he sails out of London as a boatswain's mate on a trading ship bound for Borneo. And when he gets there 6 months later, the officers and some of the crew go ashore for water. The part of the crew that's still on board seizes the ship and sails away, leaving the others behind. So the pirates choose Radish as their captain. He splits up all the cargo to the individual mutineers, and then they sail for North America. So the next thing anybody hears of Radish is in a morning in March 1699, Colonel Pearson, who's a local dignitary, looks out his window in Sagaponack and sees this strange ship sailing back and forth along the ocean shore. So Pearson gets some of the local men to row him out, and they go on board the ship and they meet Radish, and Radish says he's on his way to Philadelphia, but he needs water and other provisions. So as a local big shot, Pearson brings him ashore and helps him make the arrangements to get supplies. Radish says he has to go to East Hampton and meet a prominent person named Mulford. Pearson provides a horse, and he and the Reverend Ebenezer White, one of his neighbors, ride with Radish out to East Hampton. They meet with John Mulford and make arrangements for things. One of the things they arrange is to get 3 trading smaller schooners to rendezvous with Radish's ship called the Adventure, because Radish wants to divvy up his loot. And his presence in East Hampton attracts a lot of curiosity and then suspicion, because they wonder what he's doing anchored offshore for days on end. Some of the local officials go out to question the officers of the ship. Radish is ashore, so they ended up talking to the mate, who says they're a slaving ship, which the officials don't believe because there's no chains, no smell, no evidence at all that it's a slaver. But before they can do anything about their suspicions, the ship sails away. Radish, in the meantime, has hired a local ship's pilot named Samuel Hand, and he wants Hand to guide the Adventure out around Montauk to Gardiners Island, and he's arranged for the 3 other smaller sloops to rendezvous there. When they get out to Montauk Point, the wind is not favorable to get up into Gardiners Bay, so they move the rendezvous out to off of Block Island, 15 miles east. So they divvy up the loot. Radish sinks the Adventure, either because it was in bad condition or he's trying to cover his trail. Somewhere between Montauk and Block Island, in that 15-mile stretch, he sinks the ship. Treasure hunters have been looking for it ever since and haven't found a trace of it. So most of the crew scatters, and for some reason, Radish and 10 of his crew decide to go to Boston. I don't know if he wants to do what Kidd was trying to do, which is clear his name as a pirate, but whatever the case, when he lands, he's arrested immediately, thrown into the jail. Unlike Kidd, he has local connections. The jail keeper is a distant cousin who arranges for Radish to go free. The governor is incensed. He puts a bounty on Radish's head. He's quickly recaptured because of the 200-pound reward, and he's put in chains and sent off to London with Captain Kidd and meets the same fate, as I mentioned. Meanwhile, Pearson's still got problems in Southampton. One of his neighbors turns him in as being an accessory to the piracy. He's questioned and in big trouble. Radish had given him 4 sealed bags filled with jewels and money, and Pearson turns it over to the authorities and says that he had no idea what Radish was up to. Luckily, he's got a lot of important friends in Southampton who vouch for him, and he's allowed to go free. But as I mentioned, people are still looking for the adventure to see if there's any treasure left. The other local site with a Radish connection is if you go to the Montauk Lighthouse and walk up the hill towards the beacon, there's a pond named Money Pond, and it's had that name since colonial times because it's believed that Radish stored loot in the pond to come back and get it later, which he wasn't able to do. Nobody's found anything there either, but the Money Pond name has remained ever since. So the piracy sort of dies out late in the colonial period and by the Revolution, but smuggling continues. The people are still trying to avoid red tape and tariffs and taxes. So there's a lot of smuggling, particularly across the Sound to Connecticut, where they don't want to go through New York and deal with the colonial authorities and then the British when the war breaks out. So most of these smugglers are not known except for one who's very relatively famous in Long Island history, and that's Abraham Woodhull. If the name sounds familiar, it's because he becomes the chief spy of the Culper-Spy ring, which, by the way, is my next book that's coming out in May. A little commercial there. And Woodhull lived in Setauket, had a reasonably sized farm. He lived on this site near Setauket Harbor, which burned in 1931. So Woodhull would fill a trading schooner with farm produce and take it to Connecticut and sell it without doing any of the proper red tape. And he had to evade both British and Patriot ships that were trying to stop smuggling and spying. So one day he's caught by a Patriot patrol vessel off the coast of Connecticut and arrested. He's thrown into jail, and he might have stayed there for the rest of the war, except he's part of this tight little band of friends from Setauket that all knew each other from childhood. And luckily for Woodhull, one of those childhood friends is Benjamin Talmadge, who at this point has left with a lot of the other Patriots for Connecticut, where he's an officer in a cavalry regiment in the Continental Army. That's a plus, but a bigger plus is he's become a trusted aide to George Washington. So Talmadge goes to the Governor Trumbull in Connecticut, vouches for Woodhull, gets him released. Before he lets him go back to Long Island, he said, "I am forming a spy intelligence operation for George Washington, and I'd like you to be part of it." Woodhull agrees and becomes the chief spy for the duration of the war from 1779 right through 1783. He's the chief spy of the Culper-Spy ring. Talmadge tells him that he wants Woodhull to stop smuggling because it makes him too vulnerable for capture, and he could end up exposing the spy ring if he's interrogated. He vouches for Washington for Woodhull, who is very has mixed feelings about the whole idea. He said he's worried that that a smuggler would be more interested in making money than working for the Continental cause. But Talmadge vouches for him. So Washington agrees. He said, just take proper measures to curb this extravagant passion for gain. Woodhull never profits from spying. He lays out a lot of his own money and never takes him many years to even get that back after the war. So another interesting connection from the Setauket gang of friends is a whaleboat captain named Caleb Brewster, who you see here in this 1950s mural on the right. During the war, during the Culper operations, he uses his whaleboat fleet to carry messages from Woodhull across the Sound to Talmadge, who gets them to George Washington. In a sort of interesting twist, at the end of the war, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, forms a revenue cutter service to go out and patrol the waters to stop people like Woodhull from smuggling. He's one of the first captains hired to run one of these revenue cutters. He does that for several years until he has a falling out with his superiors, and he doesn't take to authority well. quits the revenue service and then becomes a blacksmith in Fairfield until he dies. So that's the early smuggling story, and things sort of die off for a couple of centuries, and then the issue reemerges in the 1920s. And the reason is Prohibition. The the Volstead Act is approved in 1920 to implement the 18th Amendment, which was passed the year before, banning most sale and consumption of alcohol in the United States. So initially, this prohibition is enforced by prohibition agents, which is a small force that has a very hard time making a dent in all the illegal booze and rum running. But you do have some enforcement. This is a great picture. This is Nassau County detectives and officers that have raided a still or a supply in Long Beach, and they're emptying it out. And you see scenes like this all over the country. But the enforcement is kind of an uphill battle for a long time. But for 13 years, Long Island is the scene of much of the rum running activity in the country. For the same reasons it was a smuggling haven early or in the colonial period. That still has the 1,180 miles of coastline. Long Island beaches and coves are still pretty desolate. So if you want to get booze into the biggest market in the country, New York is the perfect entry point. The other thing that makes Long Island good is that as it starts out with individual baymen and fishermen sort of going out to get booze from rumrunners at sea, but it quickly turns into organized crime activity, and they end up paying off police, local officials, and even Coast Guard men to let them bring the booze ashore. So alcohol is still legal in Canada. It's still legal in the Bahamas. So it doesn't take long for entrepreneurs to say, well, we can go to those places, buy a lot of booze, and sell it at a huge profit in the United States. And the best way to do it is bring it to the South Shore of Long Island, and in some cases, the North Shore. The territorial limit at this point is 3 miles. So if you're 3.1 miles offshore, you can sit there with all the booze in the world and it's perfectly legal. It's only when you bring it in past the 3 mile limit that it becomes illegal. So some smart entrepreneurs start stocking up on booze and coming to right outside the 3 mile limit. And the first big entrepreneur and the most famous by far is this gentleman, William McCoy. He's a Florida boat builder with his brother. When the business goes belly up, as the economy is going sour in the 1920s, he sees Prohibition as a great entrepreneurial opportunity, and he invests in some booze in the Bahamas and sails to a little off of 3 miles off of New York, anchors, and puts up signs in the rigging saying that he's got different kinds of alcohol and what the price is. It doesn't take long for people to figure out he's out there and start coming out to shop. Other people learn about this, and eventually there's a whole line of people coming out to buy booze, and the area gets known as Rum Row. McCoy is sort of the chief rum runner out there. He makes $15,000 on his first run alone, which he uses to buy this schooner called the Arethusa, which makes he can make even more profit. Now he knows as he starts to get competitors that people may want to shortcut the operation. Instead of going to the Bahamas, they may want to steal his booze. So the Arethusa is equipped with a machine gun on the deck just to dissuade people if they get that idea. It's usually covered by a big box, but it's there ready to go if he needs it. Another view of McCoy. Interesting. A couple of interesting things about McCoy. He's a teetotaler, so he never samples his own booze. He also does something that's very smart. While his competitors try to make more money by diluting their alcohol with water, McCoy says that's a bad business model because if people figure that out, they'll go somewhere else. So he makes a point of never diluting his booze, and he gets a reputation for selling the best alcohol out on Rum Row. And people start going to him. They say, I want the real McCoy, and that expression, which is still in popular use, stems from this William McCoy. And He's very popular, does great business. With Arethusa, he could carry 5,000 cases of liquor and make $50,000 in late 1920 dollars. So that's pretty amazing. So he quickly buys 5 more boats and gets additional crews so he can really keep the stock coming in. Now, he's very careful about anchoring more than 3 miles offshore, but he's become a folk hero and getting a lot of government detention. So in 1923, he's arrested, and I'm not clear how they managed to charge him, but he's a folk hero. So at his trial, a lot of important people are testifying on his behalf, and he's got a lot of public support. So they convict him, but sentence him only to 9 months. And then because of his popularity, he's able to arrange to leave the jail every day and only get back. All he has to do is get back by 9 o'clock and spend the night in jail. And then he's free to go out the next day and do whatever he wants, as long as he's not involved in rum running. So he serves his term that way, goes back to Florida, resumes his boat building business with his brother with all their profits. And he keeps doing that until he dies in 1948. So as I mentioned, the amateur fishermen, baymen, and whoever else can get out there with a boat to supply their friends and themselves and maybe a local speakeasy. Eventually they get elbowed out by organized crime. And that starts with this gentleman, Al Capone. When he's 19, sort of cuts his teeth running the bootlegging operation in Amityville, does a good job, and his bosses send him off to Chicago, where he becomes infamous. But he's the first named gangster to sort of get involved. So as I said, in the beginning, it's only Prohibition agents, and they're sort of overwhelmed by the number of rum runners. So in 1924, 2 things happened that sort of even the odds for the government a little bit. First of all, they make a treaty with England, Canada, and other countries to move the territorial limit out to 12 miles, which pushes Rum Row much farther out, and gives the authorities a lot more space to chase and try to catch the rum runners coming in. More important than that is they officially bring the Coast Guard into the enforcement of Prohibition, and the Coast Guard gets a lot of new boats like these patrol boats, and a lot more manpower to go out and try to stop the rum running. So it's kind of an ongoing seesaw battle. The Coast Guard ups its ante, and then the rum runners will outflank them and get faster boats to stay out in front of them. And the rum runners have help from several local prominent boat yards who sort of play both sides of the fence. So they always seem to manage to come up with innovations to make the rum running boats faster than the Coast Guard boats that they're also building. So it's kind of a arms race, which is kind of fun. The most important tool for the boat building companies, and this is the most famous of the rum running boat yards. This is the Freeport Point boat yard, which was down where the nautical mile still is in Freeport, and it's owned by it was created by Fred and his brother Mike Skopanich. They built more than 30 rum runners, and they also built 15 Coast Guard patrol boats. The key element that the rum running boats use that the Coast Guard never figures out or never decides to use is after World War I, there's a lot of surplus aircraft rotary engines made by the Liberty Company that generate 400 to 500 horsepower apiece. So one of the boat yards realizes they can drop these engines into these rum running boats and get speeds of 40 to 50 miles an hour. So they start out with one and start adding multiple engines. This is where the boat yard was on the nautical mile, and it's now a condo complex on the site. This is Fred Skopanich Jr., who still operates a boat building business out in Quogue. And he did a great oral history about what his uncle and father did during Prohibition. He said, quote, "They knew the Coast Guard boats were going about 26 miles an hour, so they made the rum running boats go near 30 loaded. They were making rum runners for everybody," and close quote. And that means from the cops to elected officials who were on the take, to this gentleman, gangster Dutch Schultz, who controlled most of the rum running on Long Island from his headquarters in Patchogue. And you look at those eyes and you would not want to cross this guy, but others did and paid the ultimate price, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So the Skopinich brothers start out with a 40-foot skiff known as Wanda, which was a 40-footer with one single Liberty engine, but they started upping the ante to stay ahead of the Coast Guard. So eventually they built boats like this, which was Maureen, a 52-footer with built in 1929 with 3 of the Liberty engines. It survived its experience in Prohibition and then became Gala, the pleasure yacht you see here off the Jones Beach Lighthouse. The guys who were building these boats made no attempt to hide their real purpose. When this boat was built, the Skopiniches put a bulletproof pilot house on the deck to protect the people running the boat. Bill Cleve, the owner, was questioned by the census takers in 1930, and he said he was a plumber, and the boat was just used for pleasure. Some of the old salts who were running these rum running boats were not particularly old. The best case comes from your area. A young man named Fred Pitts, who was only 14, was hired by a rum runner and put him at the helm of an 85-foot speedster equipped with 3 of the Liberty engines. The thinking was Pitts grew up on the water, knew his way around boats, and I'm sure they figured if he was captured by the Coast Guard, they wouldn't throw a 14-year-old in jail. To make the crew even more interesting, Pitts always went out with one friend who was 12, and they were never apprehended by the Coast Guard. So they would make the trip out, the 45-mile trip out to Rum Row and back for 3 years, and never got caught. To make sure he went to the right boat, his benefactors, as he called them, would take a $2 bill and rip it in half and give him one half. When he got out to Rum Row, he would go to what he thought was the right boat, and then he and the captain of the boat on Rum Row would put their 2 halves together. And once they matched, they knew they had the right partner, and they would load the booze onto Pitts's boat. He'd bring it in back to the beach. They'd land it, and then they would store it at what's now Deep Hollow Ranch, which was there in Prohibition. It's the oldest ranch, as you probably know, in the country, and goes back to colonial days. And from Deep Hollow Ranch, they would transport it to New York or local speakeasies. So the Coast Guard wasn't the only risk you'd have to take as a rum running. You have normal weather and other potential issues, hazards you would have on the sea at any time. And the best example of that is this tugboat called the Lizzie D, which sank in October of 1922 off of Long Beach, carrying all 8 of the crewmen aboard with it. The owner said that the 84-foot tug, in his official casualty report to the government, he said it was on a, quote, cruise of the Narrows, by Brooklyn, and was carrying no cargo. And I'm sure he got his insurance payments or whatever. And nobody had any clue what the real point of the trip was until the summer of 1977, when a dive boat crew discovered the Lizzie D in about 80 feet of water off of Long Beach. And when they got down there, the entire hull was filled to the brim with bottles of whiskey and Johnny Walker, and began helping themselves. A couple years ago, the Long Island Museum in Stony Brook had an exhibit on Prohibition, and local divers brought some of their bottles and a pair of boots found on the wreck. There's a close-up. I've been lucky enough to dive that wreck, which is pretty interesting. I have one of those bottles behind me on my bookshelf. Mine is empty, like the one in the back there. But some of my friends who got there years earlier found full bottles, like you can see here. And occasionally they'll pop the cork, and they say the whiskey, having aged since 1922, is really good. And sometimes the pressure would push the cork in, and then you have vinegar or something else. But I'm told, I never got to try it, but I'm told the whiskey is pretty good if it wasn't diluted. So now a lot of the booze is coming ashore. Most of it's coming ashore, but a lot of the people going out to Rum Row were baymen and fishermen from the Great South Bay, and a lot of them had bay houses, so they could go out and fish and shoot ducks and things like that without having to go back to shore every night. So these became the perfect waypoint for storing or transshipment of illegal alcohol. It's another bay house. So sometimes they would just leave it there and drink it, or they would bring it ashore when the coast was clear. But one of the Bay Islands, Meadow Island, is so big that it actually had hotels on it, and it was so far out in the bay that nobody bothered them, so they became pretty much open season drinking speakeasies. But it was a good place to go relax. So rum running, as I said, was mostly on the South Shore because most of the booze is coming in from the Atlantic. But for various reasons, sometimes they would bring it around into Long Island Sound, and that's where you have the most famous rum running episode of Prohibition, which is the William T. Bell, which is a lumber schooner coming up from its base in Norfolk, supposedly to deliver lumber to New York City. So they're sailing down Long Island Sound in February 1927 when they encounter a nor'easter, and the sails and the steering wheel are caked with ice, and the ship is unmaneuverable. So it starts drifting up towards the shore in Bayville. A local fireman sees the ship coming towards the beach, alerts two other firemen, and they're waiting up on the cliff when the ship runs aground. They manage to shoot a line out to the Bell, and the 6 crewmen sort of go hand over foot along that line and get up to the cliff, and they get off the Bell, which is getting battered by the big waves. So they're brought to a local house and warmed up and given food and drink. And once they sort of recover, they slip away from the firemen and just disappear. So nobody's quite sure why that happened until the next day when people from Bayville start going out on the beach because the tide has receded and the big waves are gone. And they start climbing up on the William T. Bell and find not lumber, but kegs of illegal booze. So as you would expect, somebody would call the police and the Coast Guard. Of course, that doesn't happen. So for a day and a half, everybody from Bayville, and then including a couple of local gangs of bootleggers, start going up on the wreck and helping themselves to kegs of booze. It's only in the middle of the second day after the storm that a local policeman on his own stumbles upon the scene, chases everybody away, secures the wreck, and he contacts the Coast Guard. So officials start showing up, and you get this sort of the view down from the cliff. And they go aboard and start to figure out what's there and make sense out of it. The local bootleggers and the residents of Bayville took away 250 cases of whiskey containing 5,000 gallons worth about $250,000 in Prohibition era dollars. So this becomes a huge story, not only locally, but ultimately around the world. The New York Times writes a story 2 days later with a tongue-in-cheek headline, "Rum ship wrecked, townsfolk save crew, then brave raging sea to share in liquor." So the authorities removed the remaining liquor, 125 kegs. And then they're stuck with the question of what do you do with the William T. Bell? So they bring in a couple of Coast Guard cutters to try to tow it off the beach, and they can't. Then somebody gets the not too bright idea of loading 100 pounds of dynamite into the center of the hull to try to blow the ship up into fragments, which on its face is a pretty stupid idea, but they do it anyhow. Here's the explosion. All it does is manage to blow up some of the decking into the air and leave the hull pretty much intact. This gets written up in the local press, the New York press, the national press, and eventually even gets written up around the world. This is the front page of an Italian newspaper in Rome where they turn this strange episode into a nice engraving. Eventually, the Coast Guard turns the salvage over to prose. They bring in a couple of salvage tugs, and they get the Bell off the beach, somewhat battered from the explosion, but as you can see, still pretty much intact. And down here, you can see one of the salvage tugs by the bow. The The interesting thing is they tow the Bell away and nobody knows, there's no record of whatever happened to it. The presumption of local historians is they took it out in the middle of the Sound and sank it, but there's no record of it. Nobody's ever found it. Nobody knows it was taken to a shipyard and broken up or where it is. So it's kind of an ongoing mystery of Prohibition. Most of the rum runners are not like the Bell. They're these fast, speedy yachts with the Liberty engines. One of the most famous ones is Artemis, built in 1929 up in Greenport. Again, had 3 Liberty engines, could do more than 45 miles an hour. Artemis is famous because the Coast Guard almost captured it, and they only got away by ramming the Coast Guard vessel, which was also a famous rum runner called the Black Duck, which was actually captured by the Coast Guard and refitted to be a patrol boat. And here you see it in the foreground at a dock at Port Jefferson. So Artemis gets away ramming the Coast Guard boat, Black Duck, and gets away. The Coast Guard shoots it full of bullet holes with their machine guns. So the Coast Guard figures it's probably gone somewhere for repairs, and they're looking in all the local harbors, and they finally catch up to it in Port Jefferson. It looks like it's Swiss cheese, and they take it into custody. So Artemis outlives Prohibition for another use, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This cat and mouse game with the Coast Guard, gets more and more clever. The rum runners realize with these big engines, if they put, say, pour some oil into the exhaust manifold, they will have a perfect smoke screen that the Coast Guard, can't penetrate, so they can run away and disappear into the fog. But the most ingenious technique they come up with is when they're out on Rum Row, they will take the booze out of the crates, put the bottles in a burlap bag, put a block of salt and some cork into the burlap bag, and then if the Coast Guard gets close in their pursuit, they just throw it overboard and get rid of the evidence so they can't be arrested. They make a note of where they are, and they come back about 3 days later, at which point the salt block has dissolved and the cork brings the bag back to the surface for easy retrieval. I just think that's just a very clever technique. So most of the booze is going to New York by truck, some on the Long Island Railroad, some even by seaplane. But a good chunk of it is consumed on Long Island, either for individuals and their friends or local bars, and about 3 or 4 or 5, large taverns or hotels that become pretty wide open speakeasies. One of the more prominent ones is Fred Freedy's Riverside Inn in Smithtown. This is located right on Jericho Turnpike at the headwaters of the Nissaquag River. So at high tide, they could run the booze right up the river and drop it off at the hotel. Another one, that one's been demolished. It's now a town park. The Canoe Place in Hampton Bays on Sunrise Highway is still there. It was closed for a while and now has been bought by developers who are reopening the main building and building some condos to support the cost out there. This was a well-known speakeasy, which was never raided by the police because a lot of VIPs were there drinking openly, including the governor, Al Smith. So no police in his right mind is going to go in there and take a chance of raiding the place when the governor's there drinking. My favorite big speakeasy was Claudio's, which is the oldest continuously operating restaurant in the United States, and is conveniently located on pilings on top of Greenport Harbor. So when the rum runners wanted to bring in booze, all they had to do was wait for low tide, and they could go literally under the building. There was a trapdoor behind the bar, which you can still see out there. So they would just line up with the trapdoor and hand the booze right up to the bartender. You couldn't ask for a better transportation system. So most of the rum running, as I said, was on the South Shore, places like Freeport and Patchogue. But the biggest center for rum running on all of Long Island was the city of Long Beach, in part because it's close to the city with good transportation options. But the main reason was that the police commissioner, Mo Grossman, was in charge of all the rum running. So he was in league with all the crooks and the rum runners. And when they wanted to bring booze ashore, he would wait till the coast was clear and none of the honest Coast Guard or cops were around. And he'd send somebody up with a lantern up into the old city hall that you see here and flash a light, and then the rum runners knew they could bring the booze into town. So not everybody was in on the operation. In 1935, city cops were charged with unsuccessfully offering a bribe to the Coast Guard officer in charge in the area to allow liquor to land. But the enforcement was pretty spotty. Out in Greenport, a former village historian said, quote, "There were several rum running boats tied up at the railroad dock, and the Coast Guard boats would be tied up on one side and the rum running crews on the other, and they would talk to each other." This is when they weren't out at sea shooting each other. In Freeport, the rum runners and prohibition agents were very chummy. They would go out and chase each other during the day and then end up in the afternoon at Otto St. George's restaurant that opened in 1929 and is still there on the Nautical Mile. So they would be sharing drinks all afternoon. Coast Guard Captain Frank Stewart was charged with accepting $2,000, the equivalent of a year's pay, for allowing fishing boats to land booze in Montauk. And the Coast Guard officer in charge of the Georgica station in East Hampton was sentenced to a year in jail for cooperating with the rum runners in 1932. But again, some people tried to do their job. Retired Patchogue Cop Roland Baker remembered that, quote, "There were a lot of bootleggers around here. They would offer police officers $25 when they were off duty to come at night and help unload liquor at a creek, but I did not get involved with that." So life was dangerous for the rum runners. It was dangerous for the enforcement people, but the biggest danger was if you were a rum runner yourself and you tried to hijack booze from your competitors, particularly if the competitor was Dutch Schultz. But it could be dangerous for the enforcement people. In 1932, a headline in the Central Mauritius Record said, "Coast Guard shot in rum seizure." But if you were a rum runner hijacking your competitors, it was worse. A gangster named Sam Grossman of Brooklyn was found dumped with 3 bullets in his head on a quiet road in Brightwaters from running afoul of other gang. Another hijacker named Arthur, nicknamed Happy Waring, was found by a clamor off of Brightwaters. His bullet-riddled body was tied to a lawnmower, but it didn't keep his body below the surface. So even before Prohibition is repealed in 1933, so many people had gotten into the rum running trade that the price the money you can make kept diminishing to the point where a lot of people decided it wasn't worth the effort and got out of the business. So it sort of tapered off to well before Prohibition ended. But when Prohibition ended, the smuggling and the gunfire ceased and didn't resume again until 1941 when German U-boats started showing up along the coast after Pearl Harbor. So a lot of these rum running boats survived the Prohibition. A lot of them, like Maureen, that became Galley, I showed you before, became pleasure yachts, but a lot of them had commercial uses. In 1947, when the Fire Island Ferries Company was formed, they needed to put together a fleet in a hurry. So they started out with 4 vessels, including an ex-rum runner named Vagabond that they renamed the Fire Island Miss. And you can see it still looks like a rum runner. Eventually it was rebuilt, it looked more like a ferry boat. And another one that survived for commercial use was Artemis, which it's famous. It was renamed the South Bay Courier and run out to Fire Island by another ferry company. So that's the end of the marine smuggling story. I'm going to stop the share and let's see if anybody has any questions.
If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type it in the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature.
We have a lot of welcomes from all over the world, which is pretty cool. Will a recording of the talk be made available? I believe so. Yep. Steve, I'm going to give them the details on that.
Yeah, what we'll do is usually within a few days, we'll upload it on the East Hampton Library's YouTube page, which is ehamlib. And we have a question from Lewis. Any speakeasy places in East Hampton?
I don't have any that I've heard of particularly. Pretty much you could find, you know, a local bar or somebody's backyard or, you know, living room in every community on Long Island. You know, Prohibition was somewhat porous. I mentioned the most famous ones. Every big community had some place you could get booze. I'm sure Montauk, being so remote, must have had at least one bar you could go to. And, you know, if it was just locals hanging around, I'm sure they'd serve you whatever you want. But I don't have any specific thing. I don't know if Shagwan was operating back then. They might have. If they were, I wouldn't be surprised if they were serving their friends. But I don't have any specifics for you.
You can see me.
Walter,
You have a question, Walter?
Yes, I related to the Fordham family out in Southampton, the original guy who was the second minister. And I was looking at other Fordham people when they had a privateer exhibition in, I don't know, Sag Harbor. And that was interesting. I don't think this person was in our family, but he did have my mother's nose, the picture, and so I could see the family resemblance. But he was a privateer in the late 1700s, and I wondered if you could touch a little bit on any of the privateer operations and how you get to be a privateer. And
you missed that at the beginning. You got the license and then you became a
oh, I missed that in the front. Okay, you already went through that.
well, just a quick recap for you is privateers are basically government sanctioned pirates. You get a commission to go out after enemy vessels. So in the case of the Long Island privateers like Captain Kidd, you're basically authorized to take any Spanish or French vessels. But if you take anything else, then you're a pirate, which is what happened to Captain Kidd. But you know, it's only something you can do in wartime. It happened up through the Civil War and then sort of died off. But you're basically a government-sanctioned pirate with limited. You can only be an enemy vessel. You can't take neutral vessels, and clearly not any vessels from your own country.
Right.
Let's see. Did Joe Kennedy run booze through Long Island? Not that I've ever heard of. You know, he may have had middlemen that came in from Rum Row, but I've never seen any direct connection of Joe Kennedy to Long Island or rum running. Was the population of Eastern Long Island pro-prohibition? I doubt it was more. It says the Springs Church was a meeting place for the Women's Christians Temperance Unit. As far as I know, all of Long Island was sort of mostly neutral or anti-prohibition because people like to drink. But you always had pockets of people that thought drinking was creating havoc and they would oppose it. But the East End is always kind of its own culture. Like in the Civil War, you had a lot of pro-South sentiment, particularly on the North Fork. But I think Prohibition was kind of universally thought to be a failure. Unless you were a women's temperance person, and they were all over the place. Let's see, bootlegging stories to Nyack Bay and Sag Harbor. I don't. I'm sure Sag Harbor had a lot of this activity. Pretty much it was everywhere. A lot of times when I do these lectures, I get people who said, "Oh, my uncle's, Caleb from Setauket or wherever, was a rum runner." I mean, it was pretty widespread on Long Island. Type of aircraft was the engines used in? The Liberty engines would have been used in fighter planes, like the Red Baron, or the American version of Red Baron, like the Spads and any of the Allied ones. You've probably seen pictures of them. The big rotary engines with the spark plugs, the ignition thing sticking out on the around the rim of it.
We have one person who would just like to have the email address for buying the book. I could type it in the chat.
Okay. My email is Bill Bleyer, BLEYER @gmail.com. You can email me to get on my mailing list, and if you'd like a signed and inscribed copy of the book, if you're on Long Island, unfortunately, you have to pay sales tax. So the book is $22, the tax is $2, and shipping is $3, so it's $27. If you're out of New York State, then there's no sales tax, so it would just be $25. And if you do want an inscribed copy, just email me. We'll work out, arrange to get me a payment, and then you can have it signed and inscribed with anything you'd like in it. Okay, let's see. Grandfather was just as the peace in East Hampton. He told the family to stay off the beach at dusk and dawn so he would not have to know what was going on. Like I said, it was pretty prevalent. Okay, so I think that's it for the chat. Anybody else have any live questions? If not, I thank you all for turning in. You were a very large and disparate audience. I think it's pretty cool to have people in Wales and Australia on one of my lectures. I should mention, this is one of 7 lectures that I do in various rotations. If you email me, you'll get my mail list, you'll know what I'm doing. If you're a personal friend of Facebook, which you're welcome to do, I will keep you posted. I also post everything in the Long Island History Facebook page, which is a great place to be in general. So everything I do is there. Right now I have 7 lectures. I've just, based on my 4 books. The 5th book is about George Washington's co-perspiring. If you saw the very bad, historically inaccurate AMC series Turn, which was very popular, you can get the real story in that book, and I will start, that'll be available May 10th, and I am already have 8 lectures booked starting in May, and they'll all be on the on the email blast list and on the Facebook pages. So that's it for me. Thanks again, folks. I really appreciate you tuning in. And thanks again to Steve and the East Hampton Library for hosting me.